SQL, Part 2. Up to now, we've been looking at SQL queries that are defined over a single table. And let's just review how these SQL queries are interpreted by looking at their clauses one at a time. When we think about an SQL query, we start in step 1 with identifying the table in the from clause. So usually when we want to look at an SQL query, the from clause is a good place to start. Then we look at the where clause, which applies selections. It tells us which rows to keep, those that satisfy the predicates, and which rows to eliminate, those that do not satisfy the predicates. Then we look at that first select clause, which tells us which columns we're going to keep and which columns we're going to project away. So we keep the columns that are referenced in the select clause, plus any other columns that are referenced elsewhere in the query. Then we look at the group by clause, and that's what tells us if the tuples are going to be grouped up and formed into aggregates mentioned in the select list. The having clause then is evaluated, and it's got predicates about the groups. So these are properties of entire groups that tell us whether the groups should be kept or eliminated in the output. And then the distinct clause, if it's included in the query, will tell us to eliminate duplicates in the output. Finally, before presenting the output to the client, if there's an order by and a limit, we apply those to affect the rendering of the output. Putting this all together, here's an example. Let's read it in the order we talked about. So we look at the from clause. It's over a table called students. And then we look at the where clause. It's saying we're only looking at students whose gender equals F. After that, we can look at the select clause. The department column is going to be important, and we're going to output that. But we're also going to need the GPA column to compute an aggregate. Now we can look at the group by clause. Grouping is done by department, which makes sense. Now we can see that that department column in the output can be extracted from each group. And then the having clause tells us that we're only going to keep those groups that have 2 or more records in them. And finally, before rendering the output, we'll order it by the department alphabetically in ascending order.